In June of 2020, we're coming to the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of one of the key conflicts which would take us out of the World War II era and firmly into the Cold War. I mean, of course, the Korean War. An especially poignant war for our times, with its seemingly endless war on terror, now incidentally being fought by soldiers who were born after it started. But much like the Korean War during its time, often we don't think about it. And this is probably on purpose. Let me explain. The US war in Vietnam depressed, divided, and threatened the very fabric of American civilization. After that, the war on terror needed a low profile, so as not to make the people rally for its end, as the student movement did in the 1960s and 1970s against Vietnam. The Korean War had a similar dynamic. Think of the world in 1950. The whole globe had just suffered one of the most catastrophic events in human history. We'd not recovered, and many had very fresh memories of lost family members, rationing, and the costs of mobilization. So the Korean War was fought with a low profile. So low, it's been nicknamed the Forgotten War. This profile doesn't take away, though, that 3 million people died in the conflict. It doesn't subtract from the fact that 1 in 10 Koreans would be dead. More death than either the Chinese Civil War or the Vietnam War. So, in the first major conflict of the Cold War, we're going to tell the story about what happened on the Korean Peninsula between 1950 and 1953. The reason why we have two Koreas, which always seem at the brink of conflict to this day. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. Our story begins not during the Second World War this time, but rather in the late 19th century. The Korean Peninsula was more or less under Chinese influence. That is until the Sino-Japanese War in 1894. The Japanese victory made Korea an independent empire. They enjoyed about 10 years of freedom before Japan's expansionistic aims made them a Japanese protectorate in the wake of a different war with the Russians. By 1910, the peninsula had been annexed into a burgeoning Japanese empire. The Koreans didn't take this lying down, however, and the factions which would eventually become the belligerents of the Korean War took shape in resistance to Japanese occupation. The first was a government in exile founded by Korean nationalists and living within the Republic of China. The second faction was a communist resistance movement. They were scattered guerrillas resisting the Japanese authority. Both camps had armies recruited and trained in the different factions of China, made up primarily of Korean refugees who had fled Japanese annexation. The military nationalist leader was Yi Pom-sok, and the communist military leader was Kim Il-sung. Yes, Rocket Man's grandfather. Then World War II happened. Japan found itself as a vital member of the Axis powers, and at war with Western powers, and by war's end, with the Soviet Union as well. Some of these countries vowed to free Korea after the war. In the dying days of that war, the Soviets moved troops into the upper part of the Korean Peninsula. After Japan's surrender, the United States and the USSR agreed to split Korea into occupation zones, similar to what occurred in Germany around the same time. The agreement split the peninsula at the 38th parallel. The initial deal was that this would last for about 5 years, while the US and the USSR worked out an independence plan. Clearly, that worked out well. So, the US began to occupy the southern half of the Korean Peninsula, and the post-war era began. To keep order, they attempted to put the Japanese colonial administrators into power. For obvious reasons, the Koreans began to protest, and the US had to back down on that plan. Despite that, many of the leaders in the Republic of Korea, what is often called simply South Korea, had been collaborators with the Japanese authority during the occupation. This decision by the US, of course, was in opposition to a provisional government called the People's Republic of Korea, already set up in the wake of the Japanese surrender. The Americans thought it was a communist and outlawed the party in the South, along with the right to strike. While in the North, the Soviets co-opted this government, and it became the seeds of what would be the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It was one possible path to reunification, but, well, here we are. Elections were run in 1948 with help from the United Nations. Communist Koreans and the Soviet authorities, as well as many South Korean politicians, had issues with the fairness of the election and opted to boycott it. Without elections in the North, the South elected Syngman Rhee to the presidency of Korea. North Korea then held an election a few months later, and with this disagreement, Korea was now two Koreas, and the division established here continues to this very moment, or at least the moment we filmed this. 1 year later, the Chinese Civil War ended with a communist victory. During that war, North Koreans had given the Chinese communists support, and they've been allies ever since. As a way to say thank you, many North Korean volunteers in that war were able to take their supplies back home with them. The North Koreans now had a force of veterans, combat experienced and well supplied, ready for a new fight to unify their homeland. The Chinese also promised that if war broke out, they'd have North Korea's back. Remember that point for later. The US saw the massive new communist nation of China as a considerable loss to its own global strategic aims, and also as a threat to the hope of turning former European colonies in Southeast Asia into capitalist and only kind of sort of colonies of US corporations. China, remembering the legacy of the century of humiliation and the effect of European dominance over the old Chinese Empire, vowed to oppose the West and promote communist revolutions on any country which borders it. So, with that shot in the arm, North Korea did just that. Since the election, communist insurgencies had broken out all around South Korea. Fighting broke out at the Korean border, and once they had Chinese support the next year, both fronts went into overdrive. North Korean guerrillas and commandos fought a campaign against the South Koreans. The border skirmishes turned into full-on battles. The South Korean government launched a forceful response, which subdued the conflict, for now, but the writing was on the wall. The North Korean leader was Kim Il-sung. Remember him? He thought he'd dealt a significant blow to the South Korean military. Kim began to prepare for a major invasion to finish this once and for all. He approached both Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and the chairman of China's new communist government, Mao Zedong, for support in this project, and he got it. The Chinese sent soldiers close to the North Korean border, and the Soviets sent their best generals to the northern capital of Pyongyang to plan. In June of 1950, Kim called for a peninsula-wide election, which Rhee rejected. Neither the US military or the CIA in South Korea, however, anticipated an attack. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean army pushed past the border on the 38th parallel. Rhee left the South Korean capital of Seoul as it's quite close to the border. The North Koreans outgunned their enemy and continued to push south. To stop them, the South Koreans tried to find a way to make it challenging for the North Koreans to keep moving. One effort included blowing up a bridge with thousands of refugees crossing it to keep the North Koreans from crossing the Han River. Despite these efforts, 2 days after the invasion, Seoul fell. The day after that, President Rhee ordered a massacre of anyone he suspected aiding the North Koreans. The South Korean army collapsed in a matter of days. The US President Harry Truman decided to intervene when he got confirmation that the USSR was not sending troops into the fight. The Americans had a massive asset in the region in Japan, and they needed to protect it from communist influence coming across the sea. The action was also intense over at the United Nations. The conflict would be their first big test of the international order established after the Second World War. The Security Council condemned the invasion. Protesting the UN's recognition of Taiwan and not the People's Republic of China as the permanent member of the Security Council, the USSR was boycotting the committee. The Council assembled a resolution calling on UN member states to provide aid for South Korea. Without the Soviets there to veto the vote, the resolution passed. As Seoul fell, Truman pledged the United States' support. The invasion was compared to Hitler's invasion of Poland. UN soldiers began to arrive in South Korea, but despite their aid, the North Koreans continued to make progress. One horrific action was that as the North Koreans took territory, they committed massacres of intellectuals and people who worked for the South Korean government. Less than 3 months into the war, the UN and South Koreans were pushed back to this tiny spot, the Pusan perimeter. The UN and South Korean forces, led by legendary American megalomaniac General Douglas MacArthur, planned a breakout of this line. With UN ground forces and US air support, the line broke down. They began to push back the North Korean tide and reverse the momentum of the war that Kim thought might be nearly over. The surprise landings by UN forces at Incheon on the 15th of September helped their position immensely. By September 25th, the campaign was so successful, they had recaptured the capital of Seoul, cutting off supply lines to North Korean troops still to the south of the capital. Many North Korean divisions simply dissolved, and it looked as if the war could still be over soon with a southern victory. But the war would continue for a few more years. The UN forces decided to cross the 38th parallel themselves. But you know what? That story we'll save for next week in part 2 of this Korean War history. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. To help us keep both the lights on and to feed my children, consider supporting us on Patreon via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.